All right, well, thank you all for coming out to Wonderland. If this is your first time, welcome to Wonderland Books. My name is Gail Weisswasser. I'm one of the co-owners, along with Amy Joyce, who's at the register. She's my co-owner of Wonderland. So thank you for coming out tonight. Our guest tonight is Kostya Kennedy. He is editor-in-chief of premium publishing at Meredith, overseeing special editions under People, Life, Eating Well, Real Simple, Health, Very Well, Investopedia, Time, and other brands. He is a former assistant managing editor and senior writer at Sports Illustrated. He's been a staff writer at Newsday and has written for numerous outlets, including the New York Times, Time, 538.com, and The New Yorker. You've come out tonight to hear him talk about his new book, The Ride, Paul Revere and the Night That Saved America. But Kostya is also the author of several baseball books, and that's my favorite topic. True, The Four Seasons of Jackie Robinson, 56, Joe DiMaggio and the Last Magic Number in Sports, and Pete Rose, An American Dilemma. Kennedy earned an MS from Columbia's Graduate School of Journalism, for which he received a Pulitzer Fellowship. He is taught in the graduate journalism program at Columbia and also taught at NYU in the journalism department and at the Preston Robert Tisch Institute of Global Sport. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Kostya Kennedy.
Thank you, Gail. Thank you, everybody. They might have a little trouble in the back, but I'll try to project. I appreciate you guys leaving the VIP row open up front. Everyone's going to show up. So it's great to be here at this beautiful bookstore. So beautifully curated. I'm really glad to be here and be here with all of you. And I'm just going to talk for maybe 20 minutes or so, a little bit about what brought me to the book and how I got it done. But feel free, I want to hear from you guys and answer your questions, whether it's about the story of that night, the book itself, or anything else. So how I came to write about Revere, in the most elemental level, I had what maybe many of you, if you came from book-loving families, as you probably did, I have this memory of being 8 or 9, well old enough to read, but I loved being read to and clung to it. And being read the poem, Listen My Children and You Shall Hear of the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, out of a volume of poetry, a dense volume with no pictures. And that was kind of critical, it turns out, because it left it to my imagination to kind of think about what happened. I didn't have a movie director or an illustrator telling me how I'm supposed to imagine it. It was left to me. So that's sort of, emotionally, I guess, what spurred me, and it stayed with me for a long time. But then more sort of professionally, intellectually, why I choose to write the book. There were a couple of things. One is I began to notice what a useful metaphor Revere was as a character and a figure. He's kind of a rare historical figure who, although he lived quite a long life and impacted the early days of the revolution in many different ways, he's really known for one thing. In the way St. George, who slayed the dragon, or Pheidippides, who ran from Marathon to Athens, Rosa Parks, right? People who we know for principally one act. And so people, both on the left and right and in between, use his metaphor. So you'll get a libertarian group in Michigan called the Manistee Tea Party has a citizen outreach program called Operation Paul Revere. And then you have Greta Thunberg pictured holding up 2 lanterns aloft warning against climate change. When this tariff stuff first went into action a couple months ago, there was a Canadian journalist who was writing about the Americans are coming, right? Citing Paul Revere. And just a month ago, the Wall Street Journal called Douglas Murray, who's a neoconservative journalist, Europe's Paul Revere. So there was something very useful about him being somebody for everybody and being inspiring. And the other thing that really drew me in, and it's kind of a theme through my work, I think, in other books, Revere knew what time it was in his life. And he and the others around him knew what time it was for the revolution. They were going to do this crazy, ridiculous thing, right? They were going to take on the British and the Royal Army, the best funded, most organized army in the world. And so he met the moment that night in this extraordinary way over those 7-9 hours, at great risk, of course, same with a lot of other people, but he could have easily been killed. He executed it really well, and he made his legacy. To that point, I'm going to just read sort of the opening 2 pages-ish, just a short reading, to sort of say what I think was at stake and what might have happened if Revere hadn't run. So just to level set, and I know you all know this, but I still just like to say it, he went out on the night of April 18th, 1775, and it was the next morning, beginning at dawn and then throughout the morning and into the day, that the royal troops came first to Lexington and then conquered and then went back towards Boston. So it was that period of whatever we want to call it, 12 to 16 hours when this all got underway. What if the militiamen had not been waiting at the Lexington Green at dawn on that April day in 1775 to test and slow the British? What if they had not then been at Concord a few hours later, 220 strong, ready and resolute on the high ground? Those Patriot soldiers arrived by the hundreds that morning, then by the thousands, armed and keen and strengthened in their numbers. They mustered on the damp, open field and on the forest edges along the old Concord road, farmers and tradesmen with their muskets and fowling pieces in hand. All right. They turned back the redcoats and then fired on them in their retreat, routing them out of the town and back off the land that the Patriots knew now as their own. Villagers from the highlands and the low, ministers and deists and non-believers, men dressed in whatever clothes they had, their patched and varied breeches, their worn, straight-lashed boots, a hodgepodge of an earnest crew, transformed by necessity and determination into American soldiers who that morning showed the will that would drive them in the weeks and months ahead, the will that would win the Revolutionary War. Suppose they had not come that morning after all. Suppose they had not been so timely in their arrival, not been so committed to their call. Suppose instead the seasoned British soldiers in their fine cocked hats and under their general's command had in their ransacking of Concord's barrack farm found and taken the stores of gunpowder and ammunition they had come to seize. Imagine if the British had caught the Americans by surprise as they'd intended. Imagine if, in Lexington, they had killed or captured Samuel Adams or John Hancock, delivering on the bounty that had been put on those men by the king. What would have happened to the path of the American Revolution then? If not for that first morning of battle, of impudent, plucky, stunning, and world-shifting patriot success, would the rebelling American army have continued to mobilize so confidently? Would it have stayed so unified in the face of defeat and death, have remained so emboldened to succeed? Would the army have fared so well, even in defeat, in the Battle of Bunker Hill 8 weeks later? Would the revolution have unfolded so quickly as it did? Would we have July 4th, 1776 as our day of independence? Or how much longer might the British have held their grip? Into the 1780s, 90s, the 1800s, and beyond? And if they had held that longer grip, what might then have been the implications for the establishment and growth of the American democracy in the years and decades ahead? What would be the implications today? When we ask these things, when we consider the plausible alternatives to the chain of events that occurred on April 18th and April 19th, 1775, we are asking this. What might have happened? How might the much documented and much deconstructed birth of our nation have unfolded? And with what repercussions had not Paul Revere mounted his borrowed horse and set out to ride those critical miles and those critical hours across the simmering moonlit land to rouse the countryside and deliver the news? What would have become of the revolution, of its crucial early days? What would have become of the whole, hard, taxing, extraordinary journey to independence if not for Paul Revere and his midnight ride? So that's what I sort of determined was at stake. And that's kind of an enticing thing as a writer and researcher. So now how to set about it. And my first challenge, I was regretful that I didn't start the book a little earlier, because by the time I started, Paul was dead. Most of his friends were dead too. So obviously I spent a lot of time in libraries and historical societies, right? You're going to, a lot of stuff now is online, but a lot of stuff isn't. And there's moments of great epiphany, right? You put on these white cotton gloves and you make an appointment and get brought out an actual newspaper that was on the streets in 1774, right? This one sheet of dense writing with no pictures at all, impossible to read, right? Or old renderings of Boston and the surrounding towns at that time, which was really important to me. Obviously, when you're writing a book like this, I tried to marshal everything sort of in service of the ride that I included, but you're of course looking at the context and the surrounding areas to feel comfortable about what you're writing. I also wanted to do a little bit of reporting in addition to the research, and one place I went to was the Old North Church. So have people been to the Old North Church and know about it? It's a famous place there in the north end of Boston, and it's the same church. The steeple has blown over twice but been repaired sort of in kind. That was there in 1775 and earlier, since the 1740s. And so I wanted to climb up it. That's also the church where the lanterns, to it by sea, were hung. So anybody who goes, and maybe some of you have, if you go on the Freedom Trail, you can go up two sort of public staircases to a bell ringing room. But I wanted to really go up there. And before I should tell you this, I just want you to know I'm not somebody who likes heights at all. So much so, Gail mentioned that I worked at Sports Illustrated for a while, and I once went to do a story on this kid, Chris McNamara, who was a rock climber. And he was climbing El Capitan, which is this great rock face out in Yosemite. And I went to see him, and then we were around in another part of the park, overlooking the valley on a different rock, but still half a mile of sheer cliff up in the sky. And he's standing over there, and he's talking, pointing it out, and I'm back there, 5 rows deep behind employees only, right, way back there. And I'm sort of saying, listen, man, I want to keep talking to you, but I'm just too nervous. And he was really kind, actually. He said, I have that fear too, and it's a very healthy thing to have as a rock climber. It prevents you from being sloppy or being too aggressive. He said, so what I used to do is I'd lie down on my stomach and peer out just with my chin on the ground. And I was like, thank you, that's such a great idea. So I lay down and put my chin up, but I stayed all the way back. I did not come one step closer. So now here it is, time to go up to the Old North Church, and I make the appointment, have to get special clearance, all that. Have to also then have to sign a waiver when I get there. The guy who gives me the waiver is like, okay, here you go. If you fall inside the property, we'll take care of you. If you fall outside the property, you're on your own. So here we go. As I mentioned, the first 2 stories are simple public staircases. Then you go up a couple more rickety, uneven stepped staircases with no banisters, where you get to the belfry where the bells are actually hung. And these were the same bells that were there when Paul Revere was alive. And coincidentally, or some spiritual connection, these were also bells that Revere himself rang as a boy at age 15. He got himself a job. He was a super enterprising guy ringing these bells. So now there you are. You're still 100 plus feet from the top. Now you're going on a series of ladders, and a sort of ladders this way, that way. You get to a little landing. It's dark. There's a little bit of light. Mainly the light is coming through. I went at night, because I wanted to, again, replicate as much as I could, and it was January, so it's cold. And so anyway, you're going up, and the man who's taking me is sort of scampering way up ahead in front of me, and he turns like, don't look down. So I was like, okay, he said, and don't look up. I just sort of held on. And the last piece I'll tell you about is when you get to just before the steeple chamber, there are these louvered windows, which have no panes of glass on them. They did put up mesh, because in the days when the lanterns were hung, and they were hung by a man named Robert Newman, who was the sexton of the church then. In those days, and in the days of Longfellow, who wrote the poem, pigeons were in. Pigeons came in a lot, and there was something to deal with. And now there were no pigeons, so at least I had that. But there was a wind all of a sudden, like whoosh, coming through. It's cold. I was almost crying. And then when I got up to the top, though, suddenly there was much less exposure. I was in this sort of area, and you can look out, and of course it's way different, right, than 1775. There's cars honking on the street. There's a yoga class going on at the Y. But you can look out and you can see the bend of the Charles River where Revere crossed to begin his journey. You can see the old graveyard, which was there when Revere was there. And you can see the narrow streets. You really get a sense of the landscape. And it was those kind of things that just made me feel closer to the whole event. And I tried to do as many of those things as I could. The other thing that it sort of informed me about was, we think, and this is sort of a through line of the whole thing, we think that history sort of, it happened, it was inevitable that it happened, and so it had to happen that way in some way. So, hey, go up and put the lanterns. It's not like me saying, Amy, would you mind just running upstairs and flick the attic light on, right? This man had to climb all the way up there with two thick, heavy lanterns strapped around him like this, a tinderbox in his pocket so he could light them when he got there. And even that could have gone wrong, right? At any step, these things that sort of are just little steps in our historical account were things that actual people, of course, I mean, it's obvious, but still it hits you in some way when you're working on it. Actual people did a great effort and great danger. So that was one of the reporting elements of it. I kind of followed his path as much as I could. These days you can drive it, although there's like a mobile station at Dunkin' Donuts, it sort of loses the effect. You can at the end. There's a stretch in Minuteman Park, which is still pretty well preserved. And I went there. I couldn't get a horse for the life of me, but I did ride my bike. And the houses there are still 18th century structures. And you can see it. Again, I went at night when I wasn't supposed to, but under the moonlight, and you can still feel it. You can still, the trees, same types of white birch and trees that have been there all along and were described then, and the same stones that were there that Patriots hid behind. So all of that stuff helped bring it to life along with the other research. I guess one other point to just make about the story is that the reason we know Revere as well as we do is because of that poem. And did people know when that poem, this was in 75, did people have a guess when that poem was written or published? So he wrote it in 1860, it came out in 1861 in the Atlantic Monthly. So it's 85 years later, it's already deep history. And Longfellow wrote that as a sort of call for action against slavery. He wasn't political except in this manner. He was a fierce abolitionist. And he felt that it was sort of a reminder of when people took great risk and stood for something. And it was meant to be that kind of call out. He really only talked about Revere in the poem, and that poem sort of served as history. And I think it got everything. It didn't get everything right. It got the story essentially right. It's and the poetic license he took was intentional. But one of the great things to learn about was, so Revere gets the news that it's time to go out and go to Lexington and Concord and Warren along the way, and he has to go by boat initially to cross from the north end of Boston to Charlestown. And then as he begins to tell people along the way, it's not just that they then start running after him. A lot of them get on their own horse and are riding out to Reading or Chelmsford or Lynn or wherever they're going exactly. So you can imagine looking from above, there's a sort of network of riders going out to spread the alarm, right? And you can bet that a lot of people came, but not everybody came, right? Somebody shows up to your door and says, hey, grab your rifle, we're going to take on the British. You're like, well, my wife and kids are in the back, and I've got 3 cows, and maybe not this time, I'll get you on the way back. But many people did, of course, go. So you need to really alert a lot of people. And there's no way, so by the time, in the passage I read, by the time they were coming back and there were the Patriot militia, as it was, or the Patriot just people, were firing on them, there were 2,000, 3,000 people. There's no way that one guy could have been the best alarm sounder in history, which Revere might have been, and you're still not going to get them there. So anyway, the reason Longfellow's poem is the reason why everybody here knows his name, and all of your kids know his name and all that. There'd be no Noah Kahn song about Paul Revere. There'd be no Beastie Boys song about Paul Revere. It wouldn't have made it into Guys and Dolls. None of that stuff, if not for this poem. So I have more I can talk about with the story itself or with anything, but I'd love to just sort of open up and engage with people if there's any thoughts or questions that you guys have about the story or about the book itself. Yes, John.
Did the research you did for the book, did it change your mind, whatever or thoughts you had going into the book about how necessary the revolution was, how inevitable it was, how badly how justified the colonists were in rebelling, yada yada?
Great question, and like a lot of questions in there. So I appreciate them. Justified's a really interesting question because the British, the Crown, had funded the French and Indian War 15 years before, more or less, and sort of kept the colonists safe. And they'd spent a lot of money doing that and lost a lot of lives. And now they were sort of saying, yeah, we want to get a little money back. We want to tax you. Things weren't great in London. So it wasn't a ridiculous thing. Also, the colonists weren't necessarily, it wasn't like Oliver Cromwell trying to throw over the monarchy. They weren't necessarily against the king per se. They were against the taxing. They were against the fact that British soldiers and officers were being forced to live among them in their house and kind of watching them and in the harbor. That's what they really didn't like. So there's disagreement in policy. So I think it ultimately was necessary, because how do you really govern a place? And we, over the years we've seen it fall apart time again. How are they going to really govern over here from there? And I don't. And therefore necessary, and therefore yes, inevitable, but not necessarily when it happened. Again, as I alluded to, I think in that passage, both sides really didn't want it to happen, and you had loyalists and colonists who lived together, went to church together, ate meals together, even did military training together until 1774. So I think that up until that first shot was fired, people wanted to avoid it. I just want to mention, as you talk about that, Revere was, I mentioned there were these other express riders, so I just want to talk for a quick second about the express riders. There were people called post riders who came along the post road, which I'm not sure where it is, but we're never far from it on the East Coast. And if you wanted to send a letter from Boston to New York, you'd give it to a post rider, and they'd come down in a sulky or a carriage, and a couple weeks later they'd give it to your brother in New York, whatever. Samuel Adams in the early 1770s put together this network of express riders. And they were, when it absolutely positively has to get there overnight. That was their gig. And often it was news of redcoat activity, but it could be some other kind of governmental news, whatever was essential to get out and get quickly. And Revere was the best they had. He was their best express rider. So he was the guy after the Boston Tea Party, which he took place in. I should mention, by the way, it's tax day today. And those guys didn't like it any more than we did, all right? So but he was the one who was entrusted to come down and tell Hartford, New York, Philadelphia what had happened at the Tea Party with the Suffolk Resolves, which was this document that all but declared we're mad as hell and we're not going to take it anymore. In '74, Revere also was asked to bring that down really quickly to Philadelphia, to the First Continental Congress, changing horses along the way. That's a ride of 350 miles. The ride on the night of April 18th was, the first stretch was about 12 to 14 miles, and another few miles after that. So anyway, I mentioned those earlier, the Tea Party and the Suffolk Resolves, to say that things were brewing, things were happening, so things were going to boil over at some point. Anybody, something else? Yes, sir.
I read your book and I found it to be very informative and engaging. One of the things I didn't know was the whole story about Longfellow and how history comes alive when a poet writes a poem, and that's just, from that perspective alone, it's phenomenal that history gets its breath in its lungs because of a poet.
Yeah.
And also this poet and the link to abolition. And I'm curious, I knew nothing about the link between Longfellow and the ride and abolition. How much of this story has found voice in the civil rights community? Would you be speaking to the NAACP and groups like that? I mean, it seems to me that that link is incredibly important, and I had no idea about it until I read your book.
Well, thank you so much for all the things you said. Yeah, so just a little bit on the impact that Longfellow had. So he lived just outside Boston. He grew up near there. He knew the story really well. He actually, when he was much younger, he published a story in a fiction, a short story, in a magazine, a quarterly, that had an account of Revere's own account of his ride. So he's very familiar with it, and he, as I said, he did research for his poem. He also climbed the Old North Church. And when Longfellow wrote a poem in those days, he'd already written Evangeline, he'd already written Song of Hiawatha. He was a big deal. When he wrote something, people paid attention and listened. So yes, the breath and life. In terms of, I think that I hope and believe, and Martin Luther King Jr. would invoke Paul Revere too, and did invoke him as an inspirational figure. I mentioned sort of recent cases of people using the metaphor of Revere, or the actuality of Revere, including suffragists in 1915 having a big picture of a man on horseback holding a sign saying "Votes for Women." So he wasn't certainly known and thought of as a source in the civil rights movement. I think finally, it would just seem so plainly obvious to many people, obviously not enough people, and Longfellow one of them, that slavery was immoral. It was almost not, it was, I don't know how to say it, was almost not even civil rights. We were just saying, look, you can't, this is not okay, right? So it's almost more than that. One of the interesting things, though, I will say, and I touched upon this a little bit in the book, is that in 1775, there was still enslaved people in the Northeast. It was much less, it wasn't the economic driver that it was in the South or anything like that, and it wasn't super common, but it was not uncommon. You would meet enslaved people any day if you walked to Boston. By 1780, it was gone. By 1790, it was officially, I may have the dates wrong, but soon after, it was officially abolished. And what happened is this sort of realization. Joseph Warren would talking about the coming revolution, saying, we will not be enslaved by the British. And people are like, oh, okay, well, we can't be doing that here, right? So there is definitely a close link, I think, between those movements. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I'm curious about the mentality of the people who lived there at the time. Would they have been looking at this like there was an invasion coming, or just how aware would they have been that someone was probably going to be knocking on their door soon saying you need to pick up a rifle, or were they looking more as a police force coming?
So that's a great question. And so when we say the people, that encompasses a lot of different people, right? And some of the stuff I came upon, like a reverend had kept his diary, and a farmer kept his diary. And so you could read about sort of everyday life. Some people were just trying to, cut a road through the woods so they could have an easier path to the pond, kind of stuff, right? So people were living their lives. But the Minutemen were already in place, and there had been a sort of loose Minutemen for some years, but they were put in place in more earnest. And these were principally men who were furnished with a gun, and were supposed to be ready within half an hour or a minute, but really within half an hour was the official decree at notice that there was a call to arms. And so they would take their guns with them to church, to the market, to the tavern, wherever they were. So people were ready. And there had been there was an event called a powder alarm a few months earlier, where they went up to right where Tufts University, I know we have some Tufts people in the crowd, is today, and the British took some guns, ammunition, gunpowder, cannon, with no bloodshed. They kind of went in and took it and went home. But in the aftermath of that, a lot of the militia came. They came too late, and then they realized they didn't hurt anybody, and everybody kind of went home. So people were ready. Very few people knew what was acting, as they said, that night. but people knew that there was something in the air and something brewing for sure. Anything else? Yes, sir.
Could you tell us a little about the character of Paul Revere? Was he an extrovert, introvert? Was he intellectual? Was he a pragmatist? Was he a loud guy, a quiet guy? To give us a sense of it.
Yeah, it's great. It was great to get to know him, as one does in these things. Spend a lot of time around him and with him. He was a hail fellow, well met. He a blue collar guy. Here's one thing that's really interesting, which I hadn't known. So he got extremely close to sort of the great influencers, the masterminds of this whole thing. There were more, but let's just say these guys: John Adams, Samuel Adams, John Hancock, Joseph Warren. All these guys, they went to Roxbury Latin or Boston Latin. They went to some prep school. They went to Harvard. They became doctors, orators. They all had money. Hancock especially, he was basically financed at the beginning of the Revolution. And many of them had long ancestral lines back into the mid-1600s. Revere's father came over in 1715 speaking only French, became a silversmith. Revere went to the writing school, which is essentially a trade school. He was certainly literate and certainly intelligent. And then he went straight to work as a silversmith. He was very much, used the word pragmatist, very much so. And he was ingenious. He had a job as a silversmith, as I said, an engraver. He was, and this sounds scary, and it is, a self-trained dentist. He later became he forged bells. And actually he made a lot of copper. He became a copper roller for the War of 1812, a really critical role that he had. So he was always adaptive. And the last thing, I mentioned that Revere was their best express rider. And it's not just that he was physically good on a horse, he clearly was, but he was really good at giving the information. John Adams had this quote, and the context is a little too much to reproduce here, but he just said, "Paul Revere will give you the news." And what he meant by that was not only was he honest and trustworthy, but he wasn't going to say, "Hey, how are the kids? What's going on in the farmland?" He's going to tell you what's happening. Maybe if you have a question or two, he's going to respond, and then he's going to be on his way. And they trusted him in that way. He was very much, it was a little surprising to see that he rose to that level. And incidentally, after this, even though he was much celebrated and he got a position, he was a lieutenant colonel in the militia, he never really got a position in the Continental Army. He never got a governorship. It was still sort of like the class system still existed, very much so, from England, even though idealistically they were trying to get rid of it. But he was never quite accepted, right? He was the guy that Joseph Warren told to go do the ride, right? So, but yeah, and he got along with lots of people. He was there were hundreds of people came to his funeral. Somebody else? Anything else? Yes, ma'am.
What was your best archival moment? What was your biggest surprise or delight as you were going through this?
I mentioned the finding that newspaper, which was really great. I also came across this collection of charcoal drawings of the Old North Church, of the Green Dragon Tavern, which was this tavern where they went, the Masons met. Paul Revere was a member of the Freemasons, and they strategized and plotted a lot of the revolution there, and also just of the street scenes and everything of Boston, contemporary, a little bit after 1775, but essentially contemporary. I remember seeing that and being really struck. They were beautifully done. They've been perfectly preserved. And it really, again, as a writer, it gives you confidence in your description and your understanding of how the streets work and all of that. So that was probably it. There was some other, I met with Paul Revere III, who is actually the fifth great-great-great-grandfather. They weren't all named Paul, but he's a lawyer in Massachusetts and doesn't ride a horse. But he had a pewter ladle. Not only that Revere had made, but within the family that they used for their Sunday soup and all that. So that was kind of fun too. Anything else? Anyone? Yes.
I would love for you to tell them a little bit about an important woman who you also learned about.
Are you talking about Margaret Kemble Gage? Or?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, because I've also, sometimes people ask about Rachel Revere, who was his wife, and that night she was home with 7 kids and her mother-in-law. So she did the hard work, really. She was out for horseback. Margaret Kemble Gage was the wife of Thomas Gage, who was the leader of the British Army. Then he held several posts, but he was the leader of the British Army in America at that time. And it was he who authorized and set in motion all of these events. He's also had spent a lot of time in America fighting alongside colonists. He and George Washington fought together in the French and Indian War. And he married a woman who he's very devoted to, who was from New Jersey. And she had been a long-standing, at that point, colonist family, patriot family. And early on, she said, Margaret Kemble Gage, I hope that this doesn't lead to anything that's going to hurt my countrymen. So it's clear where she aligned herself. And it was also clear that he had deference to her through various things that I touch on. And I think began to unfold. Margaret Kemble Gage described herself to a friend as being like Blanche in the Shakespeare play, The Tragedy of King John. And Blanche is somebody who talks about being doubly yoked in the art of war. Her uncle is on one side and her brother is on another, something like that. And she laments it. And there's a Shakespearean passage about if my uncle wins, I lose. Either way she loses, and she's heart-struck. And Gage talked about that. And the reason why all this is important is because at some point Samuel Adams, who is now out, quick context, everything taking place in Boston, Adams and Hancock have to get out of Boston. It's just getting too hot. People are around, vandals are coming near John Hancock's house. They could have been arrested at any time. They're out in Lexington. At some point, a couple of days before the ride, Samuel Adams was given a notice that this was going to happen. Not exactly when, but that they were going to march out here. And he described it that he was known by a woman doubly yoked in politics, and a woman of high standing. And there's a lot of evidence that suggests that Margaret Kemble Gage could have been the woman who gave a tip. So the wife of the British general is giving a tip to Samuel Adams, one of the leaders of the Patriots, of what's happening. And soon after the war began and after Bunker Hill, Margaret Kemble Gage was sent back to England, where she was later joined by Thomas Gage. So she was a very intriguing figure. Yeah. Yes.
Did you learn it all about Sybil Luddington while you were researching for it?
Yeah, Sybil Luddington comes up, and for those who don't know, she's a very inspiring story. She's a 16-year-old girl who, about 2 years after this, is said to have ridden through Connecticut many miles to warn of impending troops. So I found her really interesting. When you get into it, and the historians, a lot of people doubt whether she actually existed or not. There's no mention of her doing this ride during her lifetime. It only happened it first came up many decades later. And there was a time in her, toward the end of her life, when she was applying for war reparations, and she didn't even mention it in her application, so it's not clear that it happened. But it got revived, and there's markers along the road where she allegedly rode, and there's a statue, and she got a stamp. And it's a super inspiring story, right? I mean, 16-year-old girl running out, So that's really what I found on Sybil. Anyway, yes, sir.
I kind of want to go back to this first question you got about inevitability. You sort of read the first few pages of your book, asking a lot of questions about what was the impact of this, how would it have been different. But does your book actually sort of shed light on those questions, or is that more of just a framing device for, reflecting and digging into this really important event?
Yeah, I think ultimately it's essentially a framing device. I do come back to it here and there, but the possibilities of what that's almost another book, right? It's could have been so different in so many ways, right? It just wouldn't, I don't know, it wouldn't have happened, and you have to just think about it another way, I think. So, no, I don't really explore that. I just I think you learn along the way, and you see how tight things were and how improbable this thing was. That sort of gives emphasis, I think, and credence to why we'd ask those questions. But it's unknowable, of course, right? I can say, I feel confident saying, I asked the question about when our Independence Day would be. It would not have been July 4th, 1776. There's no way we would have gotten off so quickly, made things happen so quickly. I keep saying we, like I shouldn't have it here, but still. Yeah, so anyway, good. Yeah, yes.
You mentioned that Paul Revere was sort of a blue collar guy and he was sort of told to do the ride, but is there evidence that he pat himself on the back after the ride and sort of knew that he was doing this really big thing that we would remember for a long, long time?
Absolutely, no question. That's great to ask. So, first of all, when he was doing these other rides, it was probably a job. He got paid. He would, when I said when he came down to Philadelphia, he's gone from home 7 days. He turns in a slip to John Hancock for how much the horses cost that he had to rent, what it cost to stay overnight, and here's what I'm charging for my time. He went pro bono. So for all of you people here, on the night of the ride, he went pro bono. But no, he knew. I keep using the expression. He knew what time it was. They knew. They knew what a deal it was. He was the one who said, "Let's put the lanterns up," because he was afraid that he wasn't going to be able to get out of Boston. And when I say he was told, I just mean that was sort of the structure of it. But he was the guy they wanted. And they had, by that point, they had heard of Paul Revere in London, in Scotland, because of the success he'd had. One thing that is a reminder of like how big of a deal people knew it was then, there's a lantern on display, one of the original lanterns, and it's in Concord, which is about 19 miles from the north end of Boston, in a place that there's no way anybody ever saw the lanterns burning that far. Why isn't it at the Old North Church or somewhere in Boston or maybe in Charlestown? Just a few years after this, a wealthy person came from Concord and wanted it as sort of an artifact. He's like the memorabilia collector of his day, and that's how it ended up 200 plus years later in Concord. So, and he also, I think, Lily, to answer that question, I think later in his life he became even more self-possessed. He was a very confident person, but he'd done so well that night, and for himself and for the people around him, and I think he wore that proudly and strongly for the rest of his life, no question. Yes, sir.
Was there a second rider named William Dawes?
Yep, there was, as I mentioned, there were lots of other riders, but there was only one other rider who went out from Boston, and that was William Dawes, as you mentioned, also sent out by Joseph Warren. I mentioned how Revere went out over the river. Dawes had to get past some British guards and went out by land. Equally, both of them could have easily been killed, equally brave, equally, courageous and dedicated to the cause. For whatever reason, when Dawes left earlier, maybe about an hour earlier, and Revere went and had his entanglement and then warned people along the way and made it to Lexington, which I mentioned was where Hancock and Adams were. And Dawes still wasn't there for some reason. The reason we first learn about Dawes at all is because in Revere's deposition, he mentioned him and says, I was concerned, where was he? Thought maybe he'd been apprehended. Dawes does make it about half an hour later. But for whatever, I described what Revere's ride meant for getting the word out. Dawes' ride, for some reason, nobody really responded. He didn't sound the alarm. Or we have roll call from Lexington and Concord, and from the towns that he went through and the areas he went through, there aren't people represented, or very few. So for whatever reason, he wasn't that effective in doing it. It may have been partly because of the personality of Revere. Revere was very well known. He knew where to go. He was just better at this part of the job, or we don't really know. But so Revere was, Dawes did go out that night, but he didn't have the impact, anything close to the impact that Revere did on what happened. Yes, sir.
If the Brits knew that he was passing information, Philadelphia, sensitive information, maybe even like intelligence from British forces, was there like a bounty on his head? Was Brits on the lookout for him? Did he have to evade, do evasive things to avoid British outposts and that sort of thing?
Absolutely. So the British had an enemies list, and Paul Revere was on it, as were Warren and Adams and some of the others. Sometimes he was giving, as you say, sensitive or I guess classified information. Sometimes he was just telling of something that happened. But the night of the ride, Boston was in lockdown, and to keep anybody from going out, but they later said that Revere being one of them. And there was a boat in the harbor. All the little boats had been taken in so that you would not, the water was supposed to be still, with the exception of a few warships, including this big one. And they were supposed to be on the lookout for Paul Revere, but Revere got by very quietly by rowing across. And he was very nervous. Well, I wouldn't say he was nervous. He was very aware that he could have been captured. He didn't take his pistols that night. And he didn't because there was still no war, right? They were still hoping not to kill each other, right? And he knew that if he'd had a weapon on him, it would have made him that much more prey. So he didn't take that. And when he did encounter some British soldiers, I said how everybody knew his name, but remember, almost nobody knew what he looked like unless you lived right around there or you happened to see him, because there was no TV, obviously, there were no pictures in the paper, there was no way to know. When he said he's Paul Revere, they're like, oh my God, Paul Revere, look who you've got here, boys, kind of thing, right? So he had to be careful. The moonlight was a really interesting part of the whole story, because it's you needed moonlight to see, to do what he did, but it also meant they could see you. So, yeah. Yes?
I have a question. You've clearly gone deep in depth and are able to tell the story of somebody that you got to know through your research, and I'm curious how that compares to your more contemporary sports writing or other writing that you've done dealing with figures. Do you feel that you have gotten to know Paul Revere better than somebody that you got to talk to? And how did that affect your storytelling?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. So in a lot of my career had been sort of contemporary magazine writing, or one of my baseball books was Pete Rose, An American Dilemma, and I spent a lot of time with Pete, an experience everyone should have had in their life. But I also, so I did this book on DiMaggio called 56, and that takes place in the summer of '41, and it was about baseball. I'm a huge baseball fan, but it was also kind of about being in America in what they call the last innocent summer, where we knew the war was coming, but people were still going about their business, and being an Italian-American hero, not named Al Capone. And a lot of that research, I did get to speak to people who knew Joe, but a lot of that was accounts through reading, through visiting places, through all that. So I feel like a lot of it translated. It was certainly a little more, as I said, Paul was dead. So I was completely relying on that, but it was of a piece and in a continuum with other work I've done. And I do feel like I know him pretty well. I really do. You have anything else? Well, thank you guys all for coming. I know